So here, you are the remnants. So tell me, so we've been talking about a dream worth building, right? So what was the first principle? A dream worth building is what? Is God's dream, right? A dream worth building is the dream that God has for his church, for his people. The second principle was what? Yeah. A dream worth building requires us putting into practice what God has not only said, but what God has given as a provision to make it happen. And God never asks us to do what he needs to be done without providing the resources. And so our job is to utilize those resources and make a difference. So with that, in another half hour, Bruce will come up with his. You ready?
Yeah,
all right.
Ready.
You're on, bud.
All right.
We had a good time so far. I've just loved, hearing these truths because they're so eternal. I've heard them before, and it never gets old, does it? Never gets old. So, and
Thanks for bringing the good weather, Bruce.
yeah.
Oh, thanks.
And not only bring good weather, but bringing Ron Roberts. It's like amazing. So
I'm getting credit for all kinds of stuff.
that's a miracle.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right,
good.
all yours.
Oh, great. I feel like I'm really far away from everybody, so is it all right if I stay here, or is that because of the speakers? What's that? Yeah. It's good? Feel echo? Echo, echo, echo? We're good? All right. Well, why don't we open up with the word of prayer? That'd be great. Father, I am thankful for opportunities that you present to us to open up your scriptures, to place ourselves in a position where you, by your Spirit, can lead and direct, help us to make connections, not only with your mind and your intent, but also to find a way that these truths intersect with our lives and the experiences that we have and the circumstances in which we find ourselves, that suddenly these truths, they begin to speak into our very present and personal circumstance. So I pray that these eternal truths would just continue to motivate us to think more and more about your kingdom and what it is that you are endeavoring to do, and that you would use these passages in a way that would help us in that whole, the whole direction. And so bless our time together, and I pray this in Christ's name. Amen. A number of years ago, I read this article by a gentleman named Dave Getz, who was an editor for a Christian leadership newsletter that he would put out. And the article, I was digging over some notes, and I came across it, and I just put it in a file because it just shows me the timeliness of some perspectives that just, they don't go out of style, right? And this particular individual was thinking about the reality of technology and how it's changing and how it just moves everything closer and closer. I alluded to that a little bit last night, where I talked about how in real time lays an emphasis on the short term, right? And in that short term, it gives us a false reality on how everything just seems to just happen. So we become so reliant on this technology and we expect it to work a certain way that the levels of anxiety just continue to rise and rise when it doesn't work out the way we think. And if you're old enough to recognize that we did have a life before all this technology, right? You're the ones that are smiling, but the younger ones, this is their environment. This is the water in which they're swimming. And so it should be working the way they think it's supposed to be working. And the only problem is God doesn't work on our time schedule, right? God's working on his time schedule. And very often, you never know that sometimes you pray for peace, but do you ever think that maybe God's going to answer that prayer by putting you in positions where you will find peace? We don't like that, right? But you could interchange peace with a number of those kinds of qualities and virtues that you want in your life, and you never realize how all of a sudden God might be putting you in circumstances where he's going to develop that in you. And just because he may not answer that prayer the way we want it in this moment doesn't mean that he's not going to answer it. It just means that it might be a not yet. So I thought, as we think about that kind of concept of time and the distance between, desire and fulfillment, that we take that thought and begin to think through the lens of what God is doing in Ezra's time, but also the reality that it doesn't happen as quickly as people think. And so sometimes we could come and we have this dream for God, but when it doesn't happen quite in the schedule that we want, you might get discouraged. And then you think, what's the use? But there's a big use, because in the meantime, God is also doing a work in us and preparing us in ways that we may not even imagine until all of a sudden one day you turn around and you go, oh my gosh, look what God has just done. So listen to this quote. He said, it's on planning for the future. He says, you have to focus on what doesn't change. What does the future hold? Nobody knows, yet everybody is quick to hazard a guess. You may be weary by this time, he says, of talk about what lies ahead. He says, recently I attended a 2-week course at Stanford University for publishing managers and executives. And I heard a gentleman named Paul Sappho, director of an Institute of the Future, a nonprofit think tank back in the Silicon Valley, discuss some principles about how the future differs from what we envision. And the quote is this. He says, even in Silicon Valley, most ideas take 20 years to become an overnight success. He says, for example, Amazon was not the first to sell books online. They were only the first to do it successfully. He says, change is non-linear. A long while, nothing happens, and then it appears as if change happens overnight. Even the most anticipated future arrives late and in unexpected ways. If you see an area in which there have been multiple failures, that's the place to look for future success. And be aware of conventional wisdom about the cutting edge, because it's always wrong, right? This is a guy in charge of a think tank for the future. And all advances are going to take some time. All advances are going to require a considerable amount of effort. And so then you sit back and you think, okay, but is it worthy of my time? And then you really think, what is really deserving of this most valuable asset that we have, and that is the time that you have? Because you're going to invest it somewhere. So where are we going to really invest it? And to what will I commit the years of my life? You could look back on history, right? People spending lifetimes building cathedrals, never seeing them completed, right? So you're engaged in something, you never really quite see it finish. Is it really worth that time? So what really then makes this dream that God has placed before us worth building? And I said it first has to have, reflect God's dream, because if it doesn't, then we're always going to be lacking the resources that we need for the dream, right? All the obstacles, encumbrances, very often they could be of our own doing. God has to remove all of that. And the other one is going to require obedience. I have a book in my library. I love the title. It says, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. Because that's the truth. That's just the Christian life. So I want to look at Ezra chapter 3, and we're going to witness a people who have undertaken the task of building this dream, and what it is that they really have come to expect here. So I'd like to, maybe I'll just read this chapter for you. It's not very long, and I think sometimes we get in the habit of we don't really do a whole lot of Bible reading in our churches. You know what I mean? Like, you come to service and we get like 2 verses and then that's it. But I just want you to sit here for a moment, and I'm going to just read chapter 3. It says, when the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. I really love this verse, because how many times are people going to get together as one man? The older you get, isn't it true? It's so hard to bring unity. There's 1,001 ways that we shoot ourselves in the foot. There's 1,001 ways I think we'd like to shoot the other person in the foot. But that's a different sermon. But here it says that the people, it's the 7th month. So this is the 7th month of after they have arrived into the city. They're beginning to establish themselves now. When it says, Yeshua, son of Jehozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates, began to build the altar of the God of Israel, to sacrifice burnt offerings on it in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Okay, so here we are. It's now, the people have come back. They were carried off into exile in 605 BC. 70 years later, almost to the day, they're back into the land. And now they're beginning to rebuild everything that has been destroyed by, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. How far removed is that time from the days of Moses? That's a long time. But now they're coming together, and you still see that their framework, this worldview that they have, is that as a people, they've just hopefully learned this lesson. Nobody was paying attention to the law of Moses. Nobody was interested in God's will and God's ways. They had become so idolatrous, so encumbered by all of the customs and cultures of the people around them, that they had become so assimilated that God just said that it was time for him to bring judgment. And so he would begin to speak through Isaiah, the prophet, Jeremiah, and warn them of things that were coming. It started with the Assyrians up in the northern empire, coming down and wiping out the whole northern empire. And the Assyrians would have taken over Jerusalem too, if it wasn't that they put up a really good stronghold there. But they had started to come quite close down to Judah. And then Egypt gets in there for a little bit, but Babylon comes and just wipes everybody out. And it wasn't the first time that he invaded the city of Jerusalem. In fact, that you find that he had actually been there prior. But he was working a deal with one of the last kings in the southern kingdom, Jehoiachin. And all of a sudden that went south. And Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he just wipes the place out. I feel like this is kind of tinny. Do you guys hear it, or is it just me? Maybe you could, no, it's fine? Okay. It just seems like it's a little feedback for where I'm standing. Maybe I step back a little bit. All right. So the point that I'm just trying to give you as we're reading this together, people are coming together. They're one in their desire to build this altar because they want to get into the regularity again of what it meant to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Things that have been put to the side are now front and center for them. Have you ever felt like that in your life? Like there are seasons in your life, right, where all of a sudden your walk with God has become enlivened. You can't get enough of reading, right? You can't get enough of fellowship. I kind of got a sense of that on Sunday morning when just talking to people from Vass and from Sun River, I mean, there was a sense of joy that was in the air. One of the women that I talked to, I think her name was Mary. And Mary, she was so excited about all these possibilities, and I called my wife later on in the day, and I just said, this was awesome. I was just like glad to be here just to witness that. So here the people now, they're back into it again. They want to see what God is going to do. But then notice what it says here. It says, despite their fear. So that means that there is a level of trepidation that's taking place here, right? It wasn't like, all of a sudden they come back into the land and everybody says, oh, great, come back and, take this land again. People weren't necessarily inviting them in. But because of what Persia has done, and because Cyrus now has basically given them full reign and permission, those who had begun to, inhabit Jerusalem, they had to make room for the Jews, even when they didn't want to. And we'll read a little bit more about that tomorrow. But here in verse 3, it says, despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation, and they sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. And then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. And after that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred feasts of the Lord, as well as those brought as freewill offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. So even before the temple itself has been erected, they want to begin this sense of communion with God one more time. And so when you begin to think about that, I just want us to put just a little pause here for a second and think about the implications of that. Because they had this vision, they're going to come back, they're going to build this altar, they're going to build the foundations of this temple, and then they're going to build the temple itself. So this dream is going to require some planning then, right? It's not just like it happens tomorrow. And I can't help but just kind of draw those analogies as I go along. Building God's church, it does take time, and it takes a whole lot of effort, and it's just going to take a whole lot of planning and strategy. I was reading a book on discipleship recently, and in the book, he makes this just off-the-cuff kind of statement that when God created the world, he didn't teach people how to grow crops. There wasn't a book that he gave them and says, okay, this is how you do it. He didn't tell them how to create medicines, right? So many of the things that happened in real life were a product of this, humanity that was made in the image of God, that has a capacity that he has endowed us with. We have a way of kind of looking around and making observations and experimenting and putting dots together, and the next thing you know, there's electricity and there's heat and there's buildings. And so we're an ingenious people, right? We're creative. So when God says, I want you to go out and make disciples, it wasn't like it's like, here's all the manual. He says, these are the important pieces that have to be a part of it, but it's kind of like raising children. Not everyone's the same, right? Have you ever been around some families where they think they got the corner on that one? And they make you feel a little uncomfortable, right? Until you have your own, and then you realize, oh, baby, this is a little tougher than they said. And you can't give them back. I tried, But, and the other thing is then you realize each one of them is kind of like different. Like my oldest boy, man, if I'd have to get this close to his face, man, to get his attention. I have a scar on my right hand over here. It's a little S scar. I tell my wife it stands for Superman, but she says it stands for stupid. Because I had gotten so mad at my son one day that I just banged on the table, and I put these two knuckles all the way over on the other side. I literally had to go for surgery. And on the day that happened, all I could do was get x-rays, and that night, it was a Saturday, and I remember it because it was Valentine's Day, that weekend, and I was scheduled to speak at 750 couples, at Jansen Beach. It was this big conference, and I had literally hours before smashed my hand, didn't even have a chance to get ibuprofen, and so I'm all worked up because I got to do this thing, all these people are there, and I'm trying to get dressed, and I can't even get my hand in this thing, and by the time this banquet really started getting underway, it was throbbing like crazy. And now I had to get up there and talk to everybody about communication and love. And so I started my introduction, and then I just felt like such a hypocrite. I said, guys, listen, I'm here to talk to you, but I can't really talk about this because you guys have been really kind, but I just smashed my hand banging it on the table this afternoon. And at the end of that, man, I had the best stories. All these people coming up to me saying, Pastor, if you come into my house, we have this calendar on our refrigerator. If you move it, there's like 2 dents where I punched that thing. And that was a senior lady. So Jared, man, I'd have to get into his case so much. The third born, Luke is the toughest out of all of them. Seriously, if you're in any kind of like physical altercation, you want Luke on your side, man. I'll just tell you in a second. But if I speak really harshly to Luke, there's a memory in my head of him being in about 3rd grade, and I'm helping him with his multiplication table. And I would go over it like once, and then I did it again, and I did it again, and I did it again. And I look at him, I'm like, dude, will you pay attention? And I could just see his eyes open up like this, and then he was like blinking really hard, you know, just not to like cry. Man, I just felt like such a jerk when I mean, to this day, and that's like 30 years ago. But I could tell you, it was just, it was a reminder, like, man, their spirits are, you just can't run over them. And it's going to take a sensitivity about how you begin to work with people and how people are going to come together, because it's going to take a whole lot of planning for people to be of one man. It's going to take a whole lot of planning to accomplish these dreams that we're talking about. And we already see that in relationships. I'm just saying, we sometimes think that all this stuff in the spiritual realm should happen like that. Like, well, if God's in it, it should just work. But God is in it, and it takes a whole lot of work. And it's going to take that kind of perseverance. I mean, think about it. These people had to overcome their fear. You read it in the text, but we kind of remove the humanity sometimes from these texts. But imagine how they felt, like they're coming back and they're not being welcomed. They're going to reestablish their presence in a land with this temple that would require, listen to this, because it's implied in the text, but I'm not sure that we're really, giving it enough credence right now. When they say, well, they started their offerings, all you have to do is go back to Leviticus 23. And in Leviticus 23, it gives you a whole listing of all of the program that God was putting into a place where they would have these annual feasts that the people would come for. So, for instance, right, you'd have Yom Kippur on the 10th day of the 7th month. And Yom Kippur then was followed by the Feast of Booths. And the Feast of Booths was all about commemorating the time when Israel lived in these little tabernacles while they were still, en route into this promised land. Like all of these kinds of festivals and activities, they were always meant to remind the people of their relationship with God, the history that they shared, and it was required that all of Israel would come to Jerusalem for these feasts. So it wasn't just that, hey, I'm going to go to church today. It was like God saying they're going to start this sacrificial system and everybody's going to start coming from all over, especially since, Cyrus from Persia says, you guys can go back. I'm going to help you build your temple. So it's not just a nice little church that's sitting in a corner. It's all of a sudden now this magnet again for all of the Jews to come in their various pilgrimages throughout the year. All of which was to just reinforce for people again this relationship that they have with God, who made all things and brought them into being as a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a people of God's own choosing. I try to talk to people about that in the day in which we're living, about why our gathering together is so important. Because, see, we've allowed the technology of desire and fulfillment to just say, well, I can get online. I'll just listen to the sermon. I'm good. as if listening to the sermon was what God was talking about when he said, I'm going to build my church. Now, I'm not going to say that, you have to come every single week and look, I'm not making a rule. All I'm saying is it's kind of hard to build community if people are just online. And I would even go further and say, it's not that you can't build some community, because think about it. Some of you guys have become very familiar with like Facebook and stuff like that, never before. Some of you never did online banking until COVID, and now you guys are Facebook ninjas. Right? I mean, you're out there searching for friends and people, and you order online. This is a whole change of behavior that has taken a very short period of time. So you know that you could make some really good relationships with people. I do a Seize the Day. It's Monday through Friday from 8 to 8:30. I started it because people were in this COVID experience, and I felt they were very isolated, becoming very anxious. And telling them to have devotions was one thing. Showing them how to have devotions was another. So I just started this thing. I started every day, 8 o'clock. But that's 8 o'clock Eastern time. So I got up this morning at 4:15 and went outside because I had to have this thing going by 5 o'clock in the morning. And you know how many people from Oregon are on that program? So I took pictures of your gathering yesterday, and I said, this is where I was yesterday, and showed them the skyline across the street. And man, everybody just feels like they're a part. Like they say, when I run into people, they say, oh, Pastor, we feel like you know you. And we've never even met. So there is a level of community that can be fashioned in technology. So I'm not so old school that I think, well, that doesn't matter. No, that does matter. We have to use technology really well, though, but it doesn't take away from what happens in this text. What happens to this rhythm that God now just said it's going to start all over again? The songs, the food, the reuniting of people. I think God had all of this in mind. There was a rhythm that was taking place. And so when you read this text, you realize for that to happen, they had to overcome their fear of all the peoples that were around them. So that means it wasn't just about the planning. It's going to require perseverance. What is it in our day that gets in the way sometimes? If we're not careful, especially in this time when people are going to come together, two churches becoming one, isn't it just like, it's like a marriage, right? And you grew up this way, and this person here grew up this way, and you fall in love, and oh, this is amazing, and then you come together, and then there's fireworks. You guys remember an old book called Letter to Philip? It was a father writing to his son about, marriage, and he grew up in the mountains in Pennsylvania. And he said one of his favorite spots was to sit on the top of this one, vista point where he could look down and he could see these two lazy little rivers that would just meander away. And then if you focus down, you could see that when they came together and they formed this huge, really substantial river that looking down, you could just see how it just went on and on. But when those two little rivers came together, there was a whole lot of white water. And I'll never forget the illustration because he talked about how that's how it is when you're coming together and you're forming your own home. All of a sudden, you don't realize all the things that you took for granted. Like somebody sitting in my seat. Who said it was your seat? Yeah, it has your name on it. Exactly, right? Or, there's a whole host of just fill in the blanks. So what is it that we're going to have to overcome to really see that God's dream is going to be fulfilled? And it sounds silly until all of a sudden you realize how much that really irks you. Like, why did they do that? People come to Bethany Church. You know, our New Hampshire is 1.6% of the population goes to any house of worship. It's the least populated, Bible-believing church state in the country. The only one that's worse, or just like tied with us, is Vermont. And they got more cows than people, right? So people just don't wake up in the morning and go to church. It's not even part of the conversation. Like, I've been in parts of the country, right, where people say, what church do you go to? Where I come from, it's like, you go to church? And I'm not joking. That's really the case. So when people come to a church like mine, they're like, oh, Pastor, this is so refreshing. We couldn't find a church that really still held on to to Jesus, and so thankful to be here. Fast forward 6 months, and then that person was Lutheran, right? So when they came, and now it's like, Pastor, I really love it here, but how come we don't have communion every Sunday, right? And then just fill in the blank for all the other denominations, because now Bethany has become a magnet for all these people. And they like it when they first come, and then all of a sudden they're there for a little while, and then you realize, like, they miss their old style of doing things. This is about something new that's based on something that God has established, and that's just beginning to come back again. And I love the fact that even when they're establishing this now, God is saying to all these people, they are to do this with such regularity, because what's going to happen is that, like, you come for Yom Kippur, and then you stay for a week-long party. Like most of these festivals, right? They were week-long, just banquets and singing, and I just think, yeah, God, we need a little bit more of that. And so let me just read a little bit more from this text. It says, then they gave money. This is going back now to Ezra chapter 3, verse 7. It says, then they gave money to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre. If I had a map, I'd kind of show it to you. It's like if you have the Sea of Galilee, the River Jordan, and then the Dead Sea. On the west side, it comes to the Mediterranean. Well, Tyre and Sidon were seacoast towns. So what this text is saying, that they gave as remuneration to the masons and carpenters food, drink, oil, right? So that they would bring cedar logs by the sea from Lebanon to Joppa, another seacoast town on the Mediterranean, as authorized by King Cyrus of Persia. So remember, we talked about how God opened the wallets of the people. He's paying for it. So now it's the second month of the second year. We went from the 7th month of the first year, now we're in the second month of the second year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem. And so the leaders, Zerubbabel, Yeshua, and the rest of their brothers, the priests, Levites, all who have returned from captivity to Jerusalem, they began to work, appointing Levites 20 years of age and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. They had supervisors here that were 20 years old. Zerubbabel and Yeshua, they were priests that came from the exile. They're much older. I thought that was another interesting thing to just point out. There's got to be place, right, for the young and for the old. They're all part of this leadership. And they're here now coming together to work and supervise the building of the house of the Lord. So Yeshua, his sons, his brothers, Kadmiel, his sons, right? All of them, they come together, they join, and they supervise those working on the house of God. Verse 10 says, when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, Asaph, right? He's not just a music label. A little insight, like Asaph is a music label. But anyway, he was one of the singers. Now they're coming back with cymbals, trumpets. And they took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel. And with praise and thanksgiving, they sang to the Lord, He is good. His love to Israel endures forever. Boy, that must have been something. Again, just allow yourself to think, if you've ever had the occasion of building a home or renovating a home or something, when it's finally finished there, there's a sense like, oh man, we just accomplished something. And here, this is just the foundation. They get it all done. They're now regularly participating in this whole sacrificial system that God had given to Israel to just draw them in. They all worked as one. There is reason to celebrate. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But notice what it says. It says, many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid. While many others shouted for joy. Man, what a mixed scene that is. And then it just dawned on me. If they're weeping because they saw the Temple of Solomon, they have to be well past 70. And if they could remember what it looked like, then I would say we add at least, conservatively, maybe another 10 years to that. But there's even another point. These people came. They were part of the 50,000 that you read about in Ezra chapter 2. Out of all the people that went, only 50,000 of them, or somewhere around there, come back. It says it in Ezra 2. It's just this long list of all these names and everything like that. God had fulfilled a covenant promise. Only 50,000 people come back. Because after 70 years, it's probably hard to just leave and pack up and go. But some of the people in that 50,000 were guys and ladies in their 80s. How awesome is that? They didn't cut their engines off. They were ready for, come on, man, we have one more adventure. I want to be like Caleb when he's 80 saying, God, put me in the battle, man. I just want to take one more hill. I just turned 66, and I'm like, what the heck is that? I know for some of you, you're like, yeah, we got you beat. But for me, in my head, yeah, that's not even possible. But it is. But it's like, how much fire do you have inside of you? To really see this work progress, to see this dream come to life. I just think that these guys are so involved in this project that when it finally, that foundation is laid, it moves them to tears because they're so invested. It's not just like, hey, I'm going to go. I mean, they, like I said earlier, right, they had to deal with this sense of apprehension and fear of going back. I mean, you can make your whole list why somebody in their 80s should not be traveling all the way back. But they're like, hey, this is my home. I'm going back. And they'll do whatever they can. They're a part of this. That's what it says. And some of these priestly lines, it dated all the way back from the pre-exile. So it says, they all gave a great shout. The older priests, Levites, the heads there, they weep. The other ones shouting for joy. so that no one could distinguish the sound of the joys from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard from far away. I think then that part of God's dream is not just about the planning, and it's not just about the persevering. It's not even just about the preparation. But I think the dream is celebrating the past and welcoming the future. And I really don't think I'm forcing that on this text. Because early on, what did we say? It says that they came together to do what? They came together to fulfill what the law of Moses, the man of God, had laid out for them. A voice that had long since died. So they're hanging on to these traditions because this was an authority that began to give them a worldview of what it meant to be community, what it meant to be the people of God. They were going to engage in all of these sacrifices and participate again to renew this commitment to a God who said, "You're my people." So that's why I'm saying, like, it's true, right? They did celebrate the past again. It was a time to just remember what God called us to. But come on, you're sitting there now looking at an altar and a foundation, and if you were old enough and you were remembering the Temple of Solomon in all of its glory, you'd have to sit there and go, yeah, but this isn't that. But that wasn't an excuse not to welcome the future. Because what are you going to do? Just sit the rest of your life and then just bemoan the fact that it's not what it once was? And you're not going to embrace the opportunity that God is going to do this new thing? And how about this? How about fast forward 100 years and those people that are rejoicing now, maybe they're going to be the old ones sitting around looking and weeping about what once was. But hopefully there'll be like these kinds of people who are in the midst of the fray and they're still welcoming the future. So for me, if a dream is really going to be worth building, and it's going to be worth the investment of all that planning and all that preparation and all that perseverance, it's going to be because people have come to this place where what God really wants is the most important. And I'm going to let him shape me. And I'm going to adjust my life so that I'm making sure that my eyes are fixed and I am running with endurance this race of faith. So those tears were mixed with regret and with sorrow. There was some of that on Sunday too, right? I had a number of sidebar conversations with people about what once was. And they're happy to put this behind them now. But you and I both know it's easier said to do on the day when everybody's having the party. It's what comes after the party. It's like when life really happens. So these tears mixed with regret and joy, but the tears must also bear witness to the promise that we're the people of God, that he's not going to abandon the promise that he made to his father Abraham, that he is going to establish a work through his people that's going to bless all the nations of the world. God has brought for himself a chosen people, a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a people of his own choosing, which, by the way, is exactly the words that were on the lips of the Apostle Peter, who said that you and I are now these living stones, because we are that chosen people. We're that royal priesthood, that holy nation, that people of God's own choosing, that we may declare the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Words, man, they're just jam-packed with such meaning in this Old Testament, now being brought into this new era with Jesus being brought forward as the Messiah and the one that's going to lead us into the land that is to come. So the dream worth building, it drives our planning, it drives our preparation and production, right? People are going to be busy. There's work to do. The vision also have long-term goals, because it's not going to happen overnight. Because you know what happened? Like I said to you last night, you do realize that after they built that foundation, then all of a sudden, it's like around 535 BC at this point. Around 520, there's this gap now of about 15 years. And what happened was the people, they got all excited about the offerings and the festivals. That temple just stayed with the foundation. And all that lumber and everything that they were ordering that came to build the house of God, all of a sudden started getting divvied up, and people started building their own houses. Until that day, like we saw on Sunday night, God raises up the prophet Haggai, who says, "Is it time for you to dwell in your paneled houses while my house lies in ruin? And you say that the time has not yet come. But you eat and you're never full. You drink, you're always thirsty. You put on clothes, you're never warm. You earn wages and you put it in pockets that have holes in it. And why? Because my house lies in ruin." So it's another lesson to us, right? That we can intellectually assent to that, but it's another thing to make it happen. And that's why when you look at these texts, it has to be that we are going to celebrate this past, we're going to welcome a future, because it's worth the effort. The dream that's worth building is worth the effort. Because it's God's plan to bring reconciliation and redemption, a quietness into your own heart, so that when things don't go well, because we live in a broken world, in the quietness of your own life, you could still sit there and just rely on the promises of God. I'll just close with one more verse. It's found in Psalm 119, verse 50. And in Psalm 119:50, it says, "My comfort in my sorrow is this: your promise preserves my life." God has been making promises. God also has been fulfilling promises. Just taking a snapshot in the life of Israel at this juncture, you realize that God did what people would think was impossible. Overcoming Babylon, and then having Persia now pay for all the reconstruction and repatriation of all the people back to their homes. A foreign policy now that didn't scatter everyone but brought them all together and said it was okay. That written statement that Cyrus is writing, we're going to take a look at it tomorrow and see the repercussions of that writing. But I think all those people, for all the reasons that I just gave you tonight, was because they came to the bottom line and said, it's worth the effort. It's worth it. Because the dream worth building is just that. It's worth everything you're going to put into it. I pray.
Spent the last year, 2, 3, maybe in one half grieving and the other half planning, we realize that what it is that we want to do is bigger than ourselves. It's really God's dream, and God's dream is to reach people because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And then we have that opportunity by the way we love each other to represent that very love, that very Jesus that we worship, that we love. And we all know, we all have bad days, but we all know we have a great God. And so as we think about the days ahead, and there is a lot of joy in our coming together, but be sure, as human beings, there will be moments. I've already heard someone say, boy, I wish they had coffee before church. So, we might be celebrating, and you want to say, what? But we are a unique lot of fallen people, but so grateful for what God has called us to do. And I can't think of anything better for any of us than to fulfill the purpose of God in our life. So let's pray and look forward to as Bruce comes tomorrow night and brings a conclusion to this. Father, thank you. As Paul said, your strength is made perfect in our weakness. And that though Jesus was crucified in weakness, he was raised in the power of God. And it is in that resurrection, that risen life, that spirit that raised Jesus from the dead that dwells in our mortal bodies through the new birth, is how we want to live, with the conviction and the filling and the comfort. So Lord, help us to be reminded of the fact that this is your dream. It's not our dream, it's your dream. And because it's your dream, and you gave everything for it when you gave your Son, may we follow that example and give everything we can to help bring it to realization. May we persevere. May we recognize what it is in the eternal purpose of all things to live your life through our fellowship. And Lord, may we never fall into the trap of saying, I'm spiritual, but yeah, church, I don't need to go. God, we need so much the church of God. We need to continually to provoke one another to love and good works. We need to be praying for each other, weeping with each other, rejoicing with each other, encouraging each other. And Lord, now as we find ourselves being more rounded with both young and old, how much can we give to each other for the young to develop a maturity of wisdom that we might impart to them, and for the old to develop a capacity of patience and grace as the young come along. But God, we pray that what we're doing and what we're about to do would change our town in the midst of changing our lives. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.